Top of the hour, detection dispatch time. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. As I was talking about, we're gonna kick this off. I'm really excited to be here with Roger from Sprinklr today and Michael Monte. They're gonna introduce themselves in a second, but we're gonna kick this off. When you introduce yourself, I really want to understand. You guys both came up into security and into where you are from very different paths, but we're all here together today. And then we're going to get into a little bit of how those paths help you in the career and help you come together to create this new version of security and how we can look at the world today. But we're super excited to get started here. Roger, we'll start with you. Let's hear a bit about your background, where you're at today.
Yeah, so my name is Roger Allen. I'm currently the Senior Director for Detection Response at Sprinklr. So this is actually one of my first roles, we'll say, in the official leading the blue team initiatives. I come from an offensive security background, pen testing, red teaming, formerly, with JP Morgan, which is actually where I met Mike Monte. Obviously, coming up in the offensive security world, it's a little bit different coming into the blue team aspects of it. I think it's a great component of what led to me being successful in my current role. But I have to say, I obviously didn't do that alone. I've had a lot of great partners in the past, and obviously Mike Monte being one of them.
So Mike Monte, Senior Director of Security Field Engineering here at Anvilogic. I do come from the non-vendor side where I worked in the Security Operations Center for JP Morgan Chase. I started as a Tier 1 analyst out of college where I was a business major. So sort of a shock to the world where, I had to pivot into understanding more networking and, starting to understand, cybersecurity at a greater depth. And throughout my life cycle at JP Morgan, I sort of played around with hunting. I ran the content team for a good time and, finished with being the global cloud SOC manager at JP Morgan before going to the vendor side and helping people sort of, with SOC functions here at Anvilogic.
And Jade Catalano, just as a recap, I'm not important on this. I get everyone together, but head of product marketing. I've been working with security companies and people like actually Roger and Monty, helping understand the challenges in their infrastructure, how they can better adopt solutions for the past 15 years. So really seeing the spectrum of challenges and how we're coming up in the workforce. So detection engineering, while it's been around for a very long time, it's a newer term as like we're hiring for a detection engineer. I'm not sure if you guys agree with that or not. Feel free to disagree. Let's have some good discord around this. But I think, Roger, your background coming from the mindset of the adversary and being on the point team. Usually the red team and the blue team and everyone are kind of fighting all the time. So how do you translate that into kind of where you started growing into in that next step?
Yeah, so I think, for me growing up as an offensive security engineer, it was really understanding what the blue team is doing and understanding like what are their SOPs, how are they approaching detection engineering, and that deep understanding of what they were doing is what I feel led to me being a successful offensive security engineer. It allowed me to better understand what am I trying to bypass, what am I trying to mitigate, how am I going to be not detected in red team adversarial emulation operations. So while I think that when you look at like offensive and defensive security, I think that both fields really need to have the experience and the mindset of both. And while one role may be your primary goal or objective, you should still be, familiar with the other side of the aspect. And I think that's one of the key concepts that I feel like is lost in just traditional cybersecurity. A lot of organizations will have this, big, firewall between the red team and the blue team. They're either not allowed to talk, or they have very little interaction. And I think that's one of the major detriments to security in general.
Can you give me, and because you guys used to work together, Monty, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, I completely agree, right? As I was a part of the blue team, we did have a lot of training courses to understand adversarial movement and what somebody like Roger would be doing on the other side. I did think that there were sort of barriers that needed to be broken for conversations to be had between the blue and the red team. But from a training standpoint, one of the key components of my growth in the space was being able to understand the other side, right? And I think that, kind of alludes to what Roger was saying. It's important to kind of be good at your side for sure, but in order to be better, right, you need to kind of understand, the other side of it, right? So whether you're on the red, understanding the blue, or whether you're on the blue, understanding the red side.
Are there any concrete examples, maybe of you two working together, or maybe yelling at each other a little bit, or other teams? Concrete example of maybe a challenge that you guys actually work together to see this outcome that you're talking about, and understanding that wall does need to be starting to break down, and learning the other side helps you with your job too.
I can't think of any off the top of my head. I think when Monte and I worked together, that was one of the areas I think where the walls were, that I think that kind of move on from that experience in our life is where I think is the realization I started having that those walls needed to come down. That was where ultimate success came from. And I feel like that was something that I learned moving on from that experience.
It's definitely a learning opportunity, right? I think that we both kind of saw it, right? As red team didn't want to kind of show all of their secret ways, right? And the blue team was getting angry because we didn't have the visibility to necessarily detect, some of those adversarial paths that they were doing. Kind of created a little bit of an animosity between the two teams, whereas they really should be working together to identify the real adversary. So a learning opportunity for me, especially from a leadership standpoint, to break down those barriers, going forward, right? And an opportunity to work together, and what we call today as the common word, purple teaming.
Yeah, and I think we've all had those frustrations, but those learning moments of, hey, let's make something better now, is what we're talking about here. And this whole concept of purple teaming, it really just seems like it's more skill sets and a conversation that just needs to continually happen, and a collaboration. I've been a really big advocate of this for the last probably 10 years almost, because I would hear from the red team and I would hear from the blue team, and they would be somewhat saying the same thing, but in a different vernacular. And so in my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, and let's go into this a little bit, like, is it a purple team, or is it really this just collaboration and constant communication between the two?
I actually hate the term purple team. And I hate whenever I'm on LinkedIn or whatever, and I see a post for position open for a purple team role. Drives me nuts. Purple team is not a job function. It's a reaction that happens whenever the blue and red come together and engage together. And the red team, obviously our goal is to emulate adversarial activity, and we should have a certain amount of tradecraft. But at the end of the day, the purpose of those operations are to inform and educate your blue team, or try and get board funding. But that's different conversation for a different time.
In complete agreement there too. I mean, I think that it's a collaboration with your blue and red teams, the people that are good on both sides, right? A purple teamer, if you're hiring for that, is somebody that may have worked in the SOC for a little bit, may not be a full expert on that side, or may have worked a lot on the red team but doesn't have much blue team experience. It's a collaboration, a sort of aspect, not necessarily a role in and of itself. So I like the idea of purple teaming, but it should be a constant communication between the two teams. And it goes back to that barrier that you break, right? Is how can we work together rather than sort of being siloed separately, and then doing an exercise that we call purple teaming, where you guys don't communicate with each other until the end, and a report comes back, and people are fighting on both sides.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, the blue team, when they're going through and they're trying to do their detection and engineering process, they should be able to reach out to the red team and say, hey, can you do a validation?
Can you simulate this? Right.
Yeah. Even can you hey, here's what we're thinking we would detect for this particular tactic or technique. What are your thoughts on it from the offensive side? What are you trying to obfuscate, or what are you trying to evade whenever you're carrying out your activity and conducting your tradecraft? And I feel like that just doesn't happen. It's okay, the blue team and the red team get 30 minutes to chat potentially, at the end at the AAR after an operation. But aside from that, it's no communications. You guys are cut off. And that's where I feel like really true purple teaming would come in, is just the ability for red team and blue team to have collaborations. I even would say like go as far as having a weekly or bi-weekly sync between red team and blue team. You know, the red team's always looking for tradecraft techniques, and someone should be passing those to the blue team. Like, hey, here's a new tradecraft I've been looking into. Obviously, there needs to be a balance, but if it's something that the red team is very concerned about, you don't want to wait until you use it 6 months down the road in future operation. Meanwhile, the organization is going to be, at risk of
At
it.
risk. Yeah,
Has there
totally.
been
I mean, I think
anything
that,
besides has there been anything besides weekly like technical check-ins and technique check-ins that you've implemented, or Monty, that you've seen teams implement or you've implemented yourself that have helped along this path?
yeah, I mean, I think that, one thing that we've done is we built a sort of a range environment, right? What we mean by that is you virtualize an environment sort of similar to, the environment that you're protecting, and you have the red teamers become blue teamers, and the blue teamers become the red teamers, and you sort of collaborate in this range environment for a 2 to 3 day exercise, right? I know that it's not necessarily, real life what you're protecting, but it's the collaboration aspect, right? It's building the culture between the two teams and getting them to sort of understand the other side, right? I think that, without kind of being on the other side, or at least getting a taste for it or a feel for it, and you sort of build this sort of vernacular of or attitude against the other, right? And I think that being able to collaborate together in sort of what we would do or construct in terms of a cyber range, is extremely valuable to kind of build that collaboration and sort of get, acquainted with, your other folks on the other side.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll say to that is, don't have training that's just for the red team or just for the blue team, right? So
Right.
we certain trainings where we would have like an offensive themed training, but we would invite the blue team. And I know that the blue team had, defensive themed trainings that they would invite the red team into. And I remember a couple of them where, we had folks from our blue team come in and they were doing offensive security based operations, and they were getting frustrated. Like they could see there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of things that they have to take in consideration, and like witnessing them kind of struggle through that and being able to kind of give some of my, my trade craft, like, hey, look at this, try this, or even explaining some of the techniques that we utilize and why they're different from what you generally understand, on the opposite side of the house, why we see it differently. I think that was probably the best collaborative events that, for me, in terms of how we develop those relationships.
Awesome. And I mean, it really sounds like when you're building a team and you're looking to hire people, this collaboration and asking questions around more of the mindset of how people are leaning in to collaborate. So how are you as a manager now that you saw the other side, you got frustrated? Let's say you're on a team that's seeing the same thing at their organization. How do you help build that bridge, or help your manager maybe understand that that bridge is necessary?
Yeah, so as I came up through leadership on different functions, it was pretty. I was very fortunate to have some very good mentors, from the get go, and they really helped me establish and instilled in me that we need to be builders of bridges, not builders of walls, or builders of bridges and breakers of walls. So a lot of times, like whenever you go into an organization, you're gonna know where the walls are. They'll become pretty apparent. You'll see groups that tend to get siloed, and it's your job as a leader to be able to start extending your hand and say, hey, I'd like to, schedule some time with you and your team, talk about the initiatives that are important to you. Maybe we can talk about some things that are important to us. How can we meet in the middle and collaborate to make the best of the situation? And that's one of the things I did at Sprinklr, obviously. So working, and I think this conversation even traverses just red team and blue team. This is, from a defensive effort, how are we working with our DevOps team? How are we working with our engineering team? How are we working with our product teams? And making those connections outside of just security. Even I think even just within security, there's this bubble, and we silo security, and security is not allowed to talk to product and these other teams. And I think that we should have more conversations starting there.
Yeah, in total agreement. I kind of live and die by the saying of being uncomfortable, right? And by being uncomfortable, you're sort of having those conversations that are breaking down those barriers, right? In order to be a successful, security operations or in defense, right? You need to know your application owners. What are you protecting, right? Having those conversations from, with the lines of businesses, right? To understand a little bit more about that, right? Not when it's a reactive time and there's an incident, you're first having those conversations with, the different folks around. And also, alluding to what Roger was stating, right? Being able to communicate across the cybersecurity organization sounds easy, but sometimes it's not, right? And, there are barriers that are spun up, but, being able to understand from a product perspective, being able to understand from a DevOps perspective, where are we going, right? What are your milestones for the year? How do they align with ours? And if there are things that don't align, right, it's a conversation from a leadership perspective to make sure that, we're understanding the direction that the organization's heading.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
and
totally. Sorry, go ahead, Roger.
I just want to throw more in there. So when you look at, incident response and security operations centers, right? Those are interrupt driven organizations, meaning, they aren't generally like project based. I mean, they'll have some projects, but the majority of their work and their operations are based upon events that happen that need an immediate response. And I think it's important that those organizations don't stay purely interrupt driven. And, like Monte said, you have to get uncomfortable. You have to have these conversations, understand what's coming forward, because it will actually reduce your interrupt workflows.
Yeah, and I feel like there becomes a breakdown because every team has a different goal. While you're working toward the organizational goal, like you were saying, Monty, and like if the organizational goals are off, that's something different. But between teams, really what you're like kind of diving into it is going to the team, understanding what their goal is, and so you can align your goals together in order to move forward and build that bridge. So you have the high level objective, and then each team can go out and have their own tasks that are working towards that high level objective. But sorry, Monty, go ahead.
Yeah, no,
I
I see exactly what you're saying, right? And I think it's a managing upward, managing downward, and sort of communication across situation, right? You're gonna have a book of work. You're gonna have milestones that are coming from the top, and those milestones will get communicated down to their leadership, and then further down to their leadership, down to, and I'm sure Roger, you can talk about how this is done in the Army, but one thing that can be a huge issue is miscommunication across different teams. Tasks and milestones can be completed in hundreds of different ways. And if there's not communication between teams or alignment or check-ins on the overarching goal that you're trying to accomplish that comes from, the top level management, there can be issues, or, you can be deemed to be unsuccessful in completing that milestone. So it goes back to communication, and making sure that you're breaking down those barriers to have those conversations and making sure that you're in alignment, even though there are separate teams working on separate components of the overall goal.
Can you go into an example, Roger or Monty, either one, where there was a challenge? What, like you said, everything's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to have people that you disagree with. Can you give a concrete example of a time where there was someone that it was a little difficult to get that community? You were trying to communicate. You were trying to set the teams for your goals as the manager, but it was a little difficult to get everyone to come together. But in the end, maybe you were.
So I'll have to think about an example, but I do want to call out one point real quick. So I think that when you look at most organizations, I think that one of the fallacies that you see in a lot of companies is security is a team, and it's their job to establish and instill security. And I think that as a world, right, we need to kind of change that mentality, right? Security is everyone's responsibility, whether it's checking phishing emails or you're responsible for secure code development or anything like that. And whenever I do our onboarding, as any of our employees come in, we have like security and compliance onboarding. And I make sure I tell people, like, you are essentially an extension of the security team. You are the first set of eyes, and at the end of the day, I think that's one of the biggest things that starts is having that everyone's part of security, and it's not just security's job to establish that.
Yeah, in complete agreement. Cybersecurity awareness is extremely important across the board, right? Obviously you have your own programs for detection engineering. We have our own programs for preventative controls, but eyes on glass across the board is, and usually, or sometimes where you find the biggest incidents, right? Something looks irregular, it's reported back. So yeah, I'm with Roger in the sense that it's important to make sure that everybody is aware that everybody's an extra arm to cybersecurity.
So, and I feel like a big piece of this comes from also your team being advocates, although not the full drivers. Everyone needs to be part of security, but starting to build your team with these mindsets involved, right? That we're talking about. So how do you start? Like, what do you start to look for? Like, what is a detection engineer to you? What do you start to look for when you're starting to build your team with all of this in mind?
So for me, the biggest thing whenever I'm hiring for any role, whether it's a leadership role, whether it's an individual contributor, I'm always looking to measure first and foremost people's passion. Is this someone that's going to come in, work their 8 to 5, and then go home and then never touch, cybersecurity after 5 o'clock? That's generally not the type of candidate I want. I want someone that's going to come home, they're going to do their 8 to 5, and then they have additional research or projects or things that they're doing that will inform them around technology and cybersecurity in general. And because they want to, because they love this field, they love this work. So, obviously passion is one of the biggest things that I measure whenever I'm interviewing. Second is natural curiosity. I can teach people to understand networking and build detections and build automations and identify vulnerabilities or even compromise systems. I can't teach people to have curiosity around why does that work, why did that work, why didn't that work, what makes this work. And I think that's the two most important things that I think I've identified whenever I'm hiring or bringing in new candidates that are the biggest components of success.
100%. I totally agree with that. And even to add on that, one thing that I love is that if somebody does not know the answer to a question that I asked, rather than trying to make it up, being honest, right? And saying, I don't know, but this is what I would do to find out, right? That means so much to me, because that means that I can task somebody with something. They may not necessarily know it, but they're going to use sort of their creativity and their what is accessible to them to sort of get to their answer on their own, right? And that means, from a leadership perspective, that's somebody you can trust, that's somebody that that is passionate and is capable to come to a conclusion without reaching out for help out every single time.
And those are some.
I'll say I cannot stress enough, like one of the biggest red flags for me is when I ask someone a question and they go so far right field, like, you're just so wrong. Like, it's sometimes, and I don't know is a better answer than just giving some wrong BS answer, because to Monte's point, like, if I see someone that is going to go that far to try and make something up and know that they could potentially be so far wrong, like, I lose a little bit of trust in them. And it's like, I don't have the trust to say, hey, I need to give you a hard task. I need to have trust that you're going to be like, hey, I don't know how to do this. Can you give me some additional guidance? And I'm totally fine with that. Like, yeah, let's get these right people in to help and get this right information in place. Or maybe they're not the right person for that task. Either way, I need to have that trust and that faith that if they don't know something, that they can speak up in from the get-go. Because if they're already going down that path, then when it really matters and I need to rely on them, I don't have that faith and trust.
Yeah, and being able to say, I don't know, but backing it up with the methodology that you would use to go find out. Or, hey, I don't know, but if this was the situation, I would come to you, or I would go find someone who could help me with this. I feel like goes a long way. So they're not trying to pander to you and you can understand all the things you're just saying. What if there's someone on the team, you're on a team, like put yourself back where you are frustrated, you were the frustrated coming up person, and you see all these things, but the manager isn't necessarily seeing what you are. How can you manage up or bring enough information to the manager to help your career both grow, but also implement some of these things that you know would help your team?
Yeah, I could start that. I mean, managing upward is important, right? And at the end of the day, you're going to know more about the field than your management. Your management's going to be stuck on meetings, communication, everything that is associated to being a manager. They're not going to necessarily know in full detail what is happening at the field. one of the things that have made me real successful in terms of managing upward is bringing data, right? Bringing data to support what you're trying to convey is extremely important in my eyes, right? As a manager and a leader, one of the things that is important to me is to understand a problem, and the easiest way for me to understand that is through, data analytics metrics that support your argument. I think that's key, as somebody that's trying to manage over and build trust with the leadership.
Yeah,
Awesome.
for me, there's a couple aspects, right? So number one, I rely heavily on hiring people more intelligent than I am. In the process of doing so, I rely and trust in them to be able to carry out these activities. But anytime I think someone's managing up, I think not only have the data to be able to support your initiative or your what you're trying to convey, but I think the other aspect of that is perception, right? You have to be able to take a step back and not just look at what you see, but maybe look at it from if you're trying to manage up, what's your manager's perspective? Are they getting potentially additional feedback from their leaders that there's no other option, like this is the way they have to go and that's what they've been told, and maybe they've already tried to fight this battle, maybe they've already pulled these analytics and this data. So being able to take that step back and look at their perception and say, well, why are they saying no, or why are they being this way? I think that's going to be critical, because there are certain managers out there that just aren't equipped properly or don't have the right skills or experience to be in a leadership perspective. And I think that sometimes it goes back to being uncomfortable. Sometimes you need to have an uncomfortable conversation with your manager and say, hey, I really think this is the right path. Here's the information, all the analytics that I think supports my path. Can you give me some clarification around why you're so against this direction? Have that conversation, but at the same point in time, before you go down that path, make sure you try and take a step back, see it through their lens, understand their perception. And I think that may help inform that conversation process.
Makes total sense. And I think that also goes into if you've tried this over and over again and you can't seem to get around it, it might be time to start looking for a new team. And so that gets into, how do you look for the right people to have longevity on your team when you're interviewing? What are some of these skill sets that people can work on to show up to the next step? Like, okay, I'm going to look for a job now. Maybe you want to stay somewhere and build a skill set first. So what are some of those skill sets? And how do you start looking at hiring a detection engineer?
So when I'm hiring for our detection engineering roles, our soccer or incident response, one of the key things I'm obviously looking for is hybrid skill sets, right? So it's great to have someone that's got a lot of detection engineering experience, but if that's their sole experience, I really would like to see where they're going outside of that kind of comfort zone and either dabbling in hack the box or dabbling in DevOps or trying to, build other skill sets beyond just writing detections. I think there's a lot of value in having that hybrid skill set and having that dual track. So for me personally, my professional side was almost purely offensive security until I transitioned into kind of more of an automation role and started building automations, which exposed me to the breadth of the defensive side of the house. So I got to work with threat intelligence and vulnerability management and detections. And I feel like that was kind of like the turning point for me in my career, and what enabled me to kind of start really taking my steps forward into leadership was getting that cross exposure from my offensive security side. And then that automation working with all the defensive mechanisms. It's like, okay, now I understand a much better spectrum of everything that goes on, even better than with some of the collaborations, things I've done in the past. And then on the side, I run a pretty extensive home lab. I've done hack the box. I've when I say passion, this is something that I've always been very passionate about, even from before my professional days. And I think is a big part of what's kind of led to me being where I am now.
Yeah, and just as an interviewer, right, as somebody that's looking for elsewhere, you may be in a position that is siloing you to a specific role. I wouldn't go down on yourself about that, right? I wouldn't feel bad. What I would say is curiosity matters, right? So when I'm interviewing and looking for people, they may have a specific role, but what matters is kind of Roger was alluding to, right? Is what are you doing outside of your time? Are you curious, right, about other things, right? It may not be your specific role that's allowing you to kind of expand and sort of learn in different functions within cybersecurity, but what are you doing outside to kind of maintain knowledge around different spaces, right? That to me is just as valid as experience in the role itself, where you're able to sort of move around and understand different areas of cybersecurity itself.
I'd like to get maybe one from each of you. You can pick it from having come from interviewing people for your team. What's a question that you typically ask that kind of gives you this person's going to go in the right direction or the wrong direction, or we need them? Is it the passion questions? Is it the skill set questions? Is it something else?
I guess for me, it's open-ended questions, right? I'm not simply asking, do you know this or that? And it's how you're able to respond to creatively and against questions that are open-ended, right? How do you approach this situation? And providing a passionate response that obviously is well thought out is something that I'm looking for, right? Is rather than short responses to something that I'm really kind of looking to understand and have you talk about something that you've done in this field that you can explain very well, and then we can build off of that in terms of the conversation.
Yeah, and similarly, one of my, we'll say, specialties on the offensive side was social engineering. So, I very cautiously watch people as I ask questions. And to Monte's point, I ask very open-ended questions. I try to stay away from yes and no responses. And I'll have people that will just get like so nervous. They'll be like, "Oh, tell me about a time that this and this and this," and they'll be like, "Yes." um, but I think as an interviewer, like when I see that, is like I take that personally and I say, hey, you know what, I need to find a way to be able to calm this person down and be able to have a meaningful conversation. I don't want to necessarily just write them off, because not everyone is comfortable in engaging and having conversation. But I think it's using some of those skill sets to get people talking and then really understand like what is their aptitude, what is their real drive and interest for this role. I've even asked people, is this your intent, is this your dream that you're trying to get into this particular function, or is this like a stepping stone for you? I'm fine with both. Like, I'm deeply committed to helping my team grow into wherever and whatever we want to be. But at the same point in time, it's just, again, it goes back to that trust and having that, that upfront conversation, asking those difficult questions. And then obviously I'm very committed to helping the team get to wherever they want to go.
And it sounds like, as someone who might be in the interview process, asking some of these questions of how do you grow your team? How are you thinking about your team? Because it's just as important that they land in the right job in the right spot as well. So, I mean, before you can interview, before you can hire, you need to get the head count. You have to have the budget. Love to go. We're coming up on the end and beginning of the year, and we're all thinking about budget. How are we going to get head count? We always need more. Would love to hear about some ways that your concrete examples, if you can. If not, just kind of how are you outlining things for people to understand what you need on your team to get what you need, get the budget you need.
Yeah, so everything in cybersecurity leadership kind of breaks down to people, process, and technology, right? So you want to make sure you demonstrate. I always call down like, okay, well, here's the risk of the process, whether we do this or we don't do this. Here's what the risk. Who's willing to accept this risk? Who's not willing to accept this risk? Is this within our tolerance? Is really the question you're asking. Then you say, okay, well, in order for us to do this, it goes down to, I need this many people to handle this volume, or we need this technology to offset this. So whenever you're going down, you're saying, hey, I want additional headcount. Me as a leader, I have to provide the justification. I have to show the growth in what is our trajectory, our volumetric metrics for our analysis. Is that based upon the volume detections our detection engineering is built, or is that based upon the lack of controls in the environment? What is the actual solution? Can we mitigate the issue and reduce the volumetric volume, or have we just actually gotten so good at detecting we're just constantly being attacked and we just need more people? So I think that's the key thing as leaders, is are we asking for the right things? I feel like in the past, in my previous roles and experience, I was not smart enough to understand what I was asking for. I just threw people at a problems and thought that, oh, this will fix it if I just get more people. But as I've kind of grown and matured as a leader, I've grown a much better understanding of how do I assess what the actual solution of this problem is. Is it people? Is it process? Or is it technology?
Love that. And I mean, it is difficult to, while you're doing this, and this is kind of switching gears. I know we're coming up on time, but it runs into this a little bit. And you're having to deal with so many different things as a manager, the changing landscape, expanding landscape being one of them, obviously mapping that to budget and making sure you're setting the team up and building a team for what's coming in the future as well, right? So, but I'd like to get into a little bit of this changing landscape that we're seeing. And it's not just changing, but it's expanding. And so, what are the main things that you're always trying to keep up with that maybe have changed or have expanded?
Yeah, I would say for me is the ever so growing landscape. It's probably a boring one, but in cloud, right? I mean, I think that cloud introduces, double the amount of log sets that are required in order to build detections against. Your threats are different, right? Your sort of attack vectors change, and being able to, train an analyst that is, traditionally, sort of comfortable with that on-prem environment, making sure that you're sort of keeping them up to speed in terms of what is required from a detection standpoint, from a triage standpoint. As your sort of threat landscape changes, what are the things to look for, right? And what are the log sets that are required in order to be successful in making sure that you're detecting threats against the cloud environment, very similar to how you are or how you were in your traditional on-premise environment, right? So, that's definitely a challenge that keeps me up at night for sure.
Yeah, I'll echo that sentiment, right? So, when you're on prem, like you've got these servers and they run this OS, and it's a lot more straightforward. Where in the cloud's like, hey, we're in AWS here, and then we have these things to watch for, and then it's like, oh, by the way, we also have GCP, and then we have these things to watch for. And it's like, by the way, we also have Azure, and so now we also have all these things and these different, similar but different technicalities between each of them, and getting a way to kind of bring all that into like what is the common language between all of these that we can say like, hey, this is an issue, and it's an issue across all three of these clouds, or it's
Mm-hmm.
that's, I think that's a big component of it. And then I'll say, just obviously keeping up with vulnerabilities. Like vulnerabilities is, I feel like the biggest Achilles heel for everything when it comes to technology, because when you look at vulnerabilities, most people don't get notified about vulnerabilities until they've been disclosed to the like NVD or whatever. Where like if you're not following the right channels and the right trends, and this kind of goes into threat intelligence, if you're not doing proper threat intelligence where you can see the chatter about these and the different places that are, we won't go into the specifics of it, but if you're not watching for the chatter of these things, like you could be completely blindsided. By the time it's reported NVD, you could have an adversary have already exploited this and it's just sitting in your back door right now. So I think that's the thing that really keeps me up at night is how are we, willfully conducting and doing our analysis and trying to capture all this chatter and understand like where is our risk vectors, what does that attack surface look like, and then measuring that against our tech stack.
Yeah, and maybe, those are some expanding things, and like something like emails might be changing. Old gateways, if you can go into, obviously phishing, attacks are still very prominent. Emails is a thing. So, that's changing. That's a landscape that's slowly changing. So if you could go into some detail on like how are you actually identifying the emails and keeping up with all the emails?
So I think the landscape across the board, whether it's emails or cloud or everything, vulnerabilities, it's rising faster than it ever have. And I think a big component of that is AI. So AI now is you can put some source code against AI, and you can actually, we've seen a couple of different LLMs that are trained to pick up on certain vulnerabilities or weaknesses within the source code, and then that making people be able to find vulnerabilities, faster and faster. So same thing with cloud configurations when you look at infrastructure as code. And so I feel like if, AI is really lending its hand in terms of accelerating the changing of the landscape. And I think it's critical that we as defenders are also looking for ways to leverage and utilize AI to try and level the playing field, to try and keep up with these attacks, right? So how are we using AI to analyze different attack vectors, and whether we're identifying signatures or identifying, methodologies, malformed packets, can we do, how deep can we go and leverage AI to, find the, efficient or the equivalent of what the adversaries are doing on the
other side
of it.
Awesome. Well, we are coming up on time. I'd love to ask you both as fast as you can. So this will be the trivia part of the hour. Promise it'll be easy. If you don't know, you don't know. But how would you quickly define detection, like a detection engineer?
So for me, a detection engineer was someone with the skills, knowledge, and experience to be able to analyze and build a methodology to detect malicious or suspicious activity occurring in our environment.
I feel like
somebody
you just read that off Google. Nailed it.
somebody that's good at data analysis from a security perspective, right? Able to identify anomalies, behaviors, statistical analysis against data sets that are typically large, and building those into alerting that is high fidelity for the SOC, right? Being able to correlate and so on and so forth.
Is there anything you would like that maybe we didn't touch on that's top of mind for you that you'd like to leave everyone with a little nugget?
I think I'm gonna end with, don't be afraid to ask questions and don't be afraid to have conversations.
I'll end with be uncomfortable.
Nice.
Yep.
I love this. I'll end with our next session. No, it's coming up on December 7th. We are going to have a little bit of a break. We'll be running some other detection engineering sessions, but the next one will be on December 7th. It will be a technical hands-on. Really looking forward to you all being here. Thank you so much, Roger and Monte, for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and my goodbye is stay collaborative. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.